everybody, and welcome to today's Career Crush Q&A. I'm Emily Aries, the founder and CEO of Bossed Up, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Jessica Grounds, a women's leadership expert with a long track record of helping women internationally and here in the United States, who also hails from a political background like myself. And so we're really excited to hear from Jessica, the founder of Solid Ground Strategy, on how she's helping women achieve their full potential and step into leadership roles in their homes, in their communities, and in their workplaces, of course. Thanks so much for being here, Jessica.
Emily, thank you so much. Thanks for all the great work you're doing on behalf of women. So happy to be here.
Awesome. And just as a quick reminder for those of you who are tuning in now, you can keep this conversational on Twitter with us using the hashtag CareerCrush. And you'll also be able to find all of our past Career Crush conversations. That way, we do these every Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern. You can tweet directly at me at BossedUp.org and at Emily Aries. And you can tweet at Jessica at Jessica_Grounds. That's Grounds with an S at the end. And so keep this conversation going. Even if you're watching this on YouTube later on and not live, we'd love to take your questions. And Jessica and I are both pretty avid Twitter users, so get in touch with us at any point in time that way. But without further ado, I'm so excited to just dive in, Jessica, and hear more about your story. So you grew up on the West Coast. You're a San Diego baby.
Yes.
What brought you to the East Coast here in Washington, D.C.?
Thanks. Well, I do like to talk about my story because I think everyone has a great story to tell and kind of shapes who they are and what they end up doing in life. At least I hope that's the case. So I grew up in San Diego, as you mentioned, on the beach, and ended up going to college in California at Pepperdine. But from a really young age, I always sort of had a fire in me. I always say my feminist spirit or my fire around recognizing I lived in a world that didn't necessarily appreciate and see women as equals. And what really solidified my idea of how to help change that was when I was in college. I worked on my first political campaign. So I was in my class in school, my junior year, I had to work for a woman candidate, or I had to work for a candidate, political candidate, happened to be a woman named Fran Pavley. And for me, it was really this inspiration that, hey, this woman is making tough, important decisions on meaningful issues, and she's a leader. And it's something that I thought was really cool and exciting, and was super young. And so I decided, hey, I'd like to help more women like her get in these leadership roles. And what I learned quickly was there weren't a lot of women in leadership. And we talk about this a lot, but particularly in political leadership, we're ranked around 80th in the world in women's political representation here in the United States.
Wow. And
I really started getting inspired by the idea that, hey, if we don't have women at the table making policy choices, making decisions about how we lead our country, what does that mean for us as women, and what is that doing? So I was 22. I literally moved all the way across the country to DC, had 2 suitcases, knew nobody, couch surfed for 5 months. And really how I got into my work was I found out there was a young woman who was running for Congress, and she was 27 at the time. Her name is Sam Barron, and she was running in upstate New York. So this is in 2004. So this is actually 2003 when I met her. So I went to an event, and I literally had an Oprah aha moment. I walked into this bar where this fundraiser for this woman, and there was a big sign that said Women Under 40 Political Action Committee. And the whole, that effort, which is co-founded by my good friend Susanna Welford, was to actually financially support young women running for Congress. And I was like, whoop, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. I love this. And what we quickly realized doing the work, I got very invested in, one of my big pieces of advice to you, all of you listening, is, try to be on a board for an organization, whether it's a company or a nonprofit. This was really the way. It wasn't my full-time job. It was my volunteer gig, but it really built my network on the board of Women Under 40 PAC. I got to meet a lot of cool members of Congress. I got to learn how to fundraise, how to put on events, and all of these things on the side as part of my career, or not even part of my career, part of my side kind of interest. And so what we ended up realizing with over the years running the PAC as a volunteer was that, hey, it's great we're supporting all these young women, but the fact was there were no young women running. The most we'd have were 5 women running for Congress, or maybe 10 in a good year. And so in 2007, I helped Susanna co-found Running Start, which you may have heard of, but we inspire high school and college women to run for political office. And the whole idea is, I think, for a lot of the challenges for leadership, and I think for each of you as a, in your career, I think sometimes we have to recognize that we as women haven't been in key leadership roles for really a lot of life. And a lot of those skills, not only do we need to change the structures that support women, meaning obviously paid leave and things that recognize the issues around women in the workplace, but we as women need to also work on our own skill building and our own confidence. And I think that we can't just assume it's going to happen tomorrow, and we haven't necessarily had the role models to do it. We all have the ability to do it, but I think we need to really nurture that in each other and for women. So really Running Start's notion was to change the culture of getting more women in office. And then I have a lot to say, but
go for it.
Story of how I got into my work, but really my day job, funny enough, before I even can make my women's work my full-time work, was I was a political consultant. So I worked on a lot of races, political races. And one of the biggest things I saw that was congruent with what I was seeing in my efforts to build these young women's political organizations was that women were not at the table as advisors for races. So I was frequently the only woman consultant actually helping a candidate run for office, whether that was a man or a woman. So really it was sort of, I think my biggest lesson for me is, even if I didn't love what the job I was doing at the time throughout my career, every place I went has really bolstered and built my skill set, but also exposed me to different challenges around the work that I love, which is building women in leadership roles in public life. And so every place I've gone, I've seen a different nugget of the challenge. And now that's really what I do under my company, which is helping not only organizations, but companies recognize how to harness women as leaders.
Love it. And I want to ask you more about that in just a minute, but your great story sort of brought up so many realities and sentiments that I hear from so many of our bosses, especially those in their 20s and 30s who are starting to get strategic about where we actually want to take our careers while we do as what you said, which is gain skills along the way. You were gaining skills even when you were consulting, which might not have been your most passionate career path at the moment. So tell me, so I have a couple of questions, and I'm trying to think of which one to ask first. But I think the first one that's most interesting to me is, tell me how you made the leap, because a lot of these Career Crush Q&As are so powerful and so profound because we hear from women who have navigated a career transition that requires taking a risk. And oftentimes we hear about the after part, hi, I'm Emily, I get bossed up, it's great. And we don't hear about the murky middle or the scary parts or the stumbling blocks that actually teach us the lessons that we carry with us into that work. So what did that leap look like for you?
Yeah, it's a two-part piece, and it's a great point. I think, I went to business school just before I tell my story, and one of the biggest things you learn in business school is actually the biggest, most successful entrepreneurs and CEOs or whatever have failed. And they've had massive challenge. And a lot of people don't tell those stories. So I think exactly right. We need to share the stories of women and recognize that we're not always going to be perfect. Even in my current state by far, constantly oh my gosh, am I doing the right thing? Or how did I do this? Or what am I doing? And so for sure. So quickly, I was the executive director of Running Start, which I co-founded. And I want to tell two parts of my transition because I think they both have meaning. One is I ended up going to work, run the women's team for Ready for Hillary. And the funny story about that is I had worked for Hillary Clinton in 2008 at our first presidential, and I had always had it in the back of my mind. The only thing that would take me away from my work at Running Start was to go help Hillary become the first woman president. So I had sort of put it out in the world that I wanted to do this, but I got an email one day from a woman who I'd actually served on the board for Women Under 40 PAC with. And she said, Jessica, the Ready for Hillary team is looking for someone to run the women's team. Would you be interested? And I was so excited. And I went through the whole process of it. And I ended up getting the job. It was this whole thing. But what's so funny about the story is this. I was walking with my friend Heather, who recommended me for the job. And I remember looking at her and saying, Heather, this is such a great example that I tell all young women and people that I mentor, that you have to build these robust networks because you knew me through this volunteer organization. You knew I was the best person for this job, and you thought of me immediately. And she looked at me and she said, well, Jessica, you're kind of right. But honestly, the reason why I thought of you for the job is because you said out loud, I want to help Hillary become the next president, and I would go work on the campaign. You physically said that.
That is
and
such a great point.
It was so profound because I was like, oh, you didn't think I was the best person for this position? You know, we have this in our head that people are just noticing our hard work. We're keeping our head to the ground. We're doing our work and they're going to notice us. And while that's the case to a point, and we should be working hard, you know, I think a lot of times we have to recognize as women that we got to say what we want and we've got to put it out there. And if I hadn't done that, Heather may not have thought of me for this great job. So that's one piece of my transition. And then candidly, kind of how it leads to my current state as the founder of my latest firm. I was planning on working on Hillary's campaign, her current campaign for president, and Ready for Hillary ended when she announced her presidency, her run for presidency, and I actually didn't get the job I wanted. And when that happened, you know, I was of course upset, but you know, I've really come to this state, I think, in my career and my life where I think things really happen for a reason. And of course I was disappointed, and I literally, friends, had planned my wedding around joining the campaign.
Wow.
So I was very committed and it didn't work out. But you know what? That's the truth. And so I had to do some soul searching, you know, post my wedding to say, you know, what do I want to do? And I have really been leading, I've really been building up to starting my own firm for a long time. It didn't happen in the timing I expected, but I think that's another really important lesson for all of us to know, which is timing isn't necessarily in your timing framework. And I think some of the best things I've done is to be specific and focused on my work and my effort. That said, be open to how that might look and shape itself. And so I think, I know it sounds weird, it almost sounds counterintuitive, but I actually talked about this on my blog, Jessica Speaks, which is on my website. But my first blog or second blog was about, it's not where you're going, it's where you're facing. Because you don't exactly know, you know, exactly how it's going to look, but it's really that you're faced in the right direction that's feeding kind of who you are and what you're passionate about. But you don't exactly know where that place might go. So it's not where you're going, it's where you're facing. And so I really kind of embraced that.
And so forgive me if I'm looking away from the screen too. I'm just live tweeting some of the great things you're saying here because I think they're so memorable. And bosses, we will tweet out a link to that blog post because that sounds like something I would love to read. And I know a lot of us will. But it's such a great lesson on like, know your goals, but be flexible on how you're going to get there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it is, I think it's very important when you're in a career shift, like it's like, especially when you're talking to people like you and I who have big networks, you want to be focused, right? You can't get, oh, Jessica, I want to work in politics. Well, what piece of that drives you? What piece of that? So you want to kind of be strategically focused on maybe what are 3 areas that might go, but be open within that. So it's a bit of a blend. I think we get very, if you will, black and white in the way we think about how things work, but really there's actually kind of a nuance of the 2 of those. So you want to be strategically focused, but open in the same way. And sometimes it's hard to capture both of those ideas. Yeah.
And I love that this is, I love your lesson, generally speaking, about growing a huge community and network. Because sometimes, and I've done this many times before, we become so focused on doing a great job for our boss, for our organization, for our cause, for our campaign, whatever, that we forget to pick our head up off the desk and make friends, right? Or like go out and be a human and have a social network. So what kind of tips do you have for young, hardworking women who want to know where to get started on how to really do that? And then also, what if you do have a big network? How do you leverage that when you're trying to make a career transition?
It's a great point. I think it's probably it's the currency of not only living in Washington, D.C. or almost any city where you're really trying to build a career is your network, is who you know. I think my first point for each of you is I think we as women tend to be less okay with transactional relationships. So the fact that Emily helps me and I help Emily, it doesn't mean that we have less of an authentic relationship or whatever that might be, but there's also a bit of that give and take in life. And I think men do that better than we do. So I think first and foremost, when you think about your network, think about transactional relationships as being okay. You know, we're bred and raised to like only have these like deeply meaningful things and relationships. And I think sometimes it's okay for us not to look that way. So that's one.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm totally going to tweet that because, some people get icked out. Like it feels icky to be transactional. Yeah. But to me, it's like, okay, great. What can I do for you? Like, please tell me. Yeah. Please be specific in your ask,
And we have to, I think we need to move towards that. Do we lose? I'm not, oh good. I thought that I lost my volume. Good. Sorry. Hello. So we often have that challenge. So getting beyond that's big. So in terms of practically using your network, it's a little bit dependent on where you are in your career, I would say. But I will say for me, when I was in my 20s, I worked really hard to go and network at least 2 to 3 days a week. I know that's a lot, but I thought, looking at organizations that were like-minded to mine in terms of my young women's political network. And again, just to repeat my story about Wolfpack, like I was working for a company that I was paying the bills and I could pay my rent and all of that, but it wasn't what I loved to do. So I knew I needed to network. So I found out about an organization I was interested in and I went to their event. So tracking those down, there's listservs in your community. If there's an organization that you like or a team of like maybe nonprofits you like, reach out, see what kind of networking events they have. So really think smart. At least about one event a week. You can do one event a week
goal,
and, just be smart about it. Now, for me, I have boundaries around this. Monday is kind of my day. So like I always joke with my husband, unless the president invites me to dinner on Monday night, I probably won't be attending an event. So like you need to have boundaries around that. There's always that, but very much you've got to get out there. You've got to meet people. And I think, for those of you who are less maybe extroverted as Emily and I are, we like to meet random people all the time, but that's all the time. Yeah. You definitely know that people who are there at an event, they want to meet new people too. And so don't be shy about kind of being confident in who you are and introducing yourself, because if they're at an event, unless they're crazy, they should want to meet other people as well. And so you just start there. You never know who you're going to meet. You never know who you're going to run into. In terms of practically speaking, of course, I need to do better at this myself, but, tracking who you've met, entering them into your contacts and just putting a little note where you met them, all very simple stuff, but make sure, you do that. Actually, one of the best tools I think right now, besides just your regular calendar, your Google Calendar or your Google Contacts is really LinkedIn. And I know LinkedIn is talked about a lot from your professional standpoint, but most people keep it pretty up to date. And so like if you lose someone, you're like, oh yeah, where are they now? You type her in and they're like, oh yeah, she's over there. And then you can cold call her or find an info email and find her information. So
and just a quick little plug on that, because I don't know about you, but I have been intimidated by LinkedIn because it just seems complicated and it doesn't have the best UX in my experience. But we have a really great webinar from our Fierce Fall series with Alexandra Anweiler Stevens on our YouTube channel. That basically says how to grow your network on LinkedIn. So go check that out on our Bossed Up YouTube channel. And she really breaks it down to like be strategic about reaching out and growing your network that way too. Because if you hate happy hour, just like Jessica's saying, like you should not go to happy hour once a week then. I'm a big fan of the one-on-one meetings or online outreach. So there's so many great ways to do that too.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say though on that, not having to go happy hour, and you need to do in-person connections, right? Because the reason why the online, obviously social media has really taken it to another level, but is meaningful is because there's real relationships behind it, right? There's real people behind it. There has to be some context and meaning. So you want to meet people and you want to connect in a way, though, to your point, I think that is comfortable for you. So so that's another, I will use LinkedIn, for example, if I'm trying to track somebody down I don't know, I look his name up in LinkedIn, and then I figure out who I know that's connected to them. It's very simple and it's pretty rad to do that. Yeah. In terms of networking too, I think it evolves as you grow in your career. I think in the beginning, you should just like go to everything you can. You never know what you're going to be exposed to. You never know who you're going to meet. And of course, as you get older, you want to be more strategic, about where you go and what you see and who you connect with. And I think as you become more sophisticated, the sophisticated outreach that would happen in your network would also be to expose yourself to networks that are not the typical usual suspects you're used to in your industry. So I work in the women in political leadership space in particular. When I go to events around that, I practically know like half of the group there.
Right,
so
right.
Trying to go to places where I'm going to be exposed to new kinds of people and new networks is another piece of that piece of networking that I think is critical.
That is so great and so practical. I love it. So one of the other things that happens when you roll up at a one-on-one meeting or write that email to sort of cold call a friend of a friend, or even walk into a room at networking, is really being able to articulate your story. And just like you're saying, it can be a little bit tricky for us women to be assertive in that process of saying, here's what I'm looking for, and or here's what I'm great at. So you help women really cultivate and craft their own personal stories. Why is that work so important? Tell us more about what you do.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of a new phenomenon as I started my firm, because I do a lot of work with women candidates and women who are looking to run for office. So that's part of the arm of my work. And then I'm also working with companies to help them better cultivate women in their companies. And I also do international work, so I have a lot of things going on. But in terms of my one-on-one work, I have noticed, and it kind of came organically, one of my kind of friends, colleagues who knew me said, Jessica, you're really good at talking about like what you've done and who you are and how that leads to what you do. I want to do that for myself. And so it actually literally happened because this one woman said, I need your help. And actually the fun story is she's a big Republican, like very conservative, and I'm a big Democrat. And so she was like, I'm going to hire you to help me do this. And it's been this great process. But what I've kind of crafted is this process where you think about your own personal story and you think about kind of what you've experienced and the things that happen when you're able to effectively tell your story is you connect with your audience, you connect with your colleagues at work. It shapes who you are. It makes you authentic and real. These are all very important things for women. But I mean, there's umpteen stories of people who ended up getting the job they wanted, or ended up with that promotion, or ended up with that connection because they connected in a genuine way with who they were speaking to. And so it doesn't mean that every time you're telling this long soliloquy of your life, but if you can capture the nuggets of your story and your foundation of who you are, and then you pull out pieces of it in the right context. So that's the more kind of like telling your story 2.0 versus 1.0, right? So it starts with literally writing down what are some powerful things that have happened to you in life, crafting this strategic idea of who you are and what you're about. And then as you get more advanced with it, you pull out pieces of it as you are connecting with different audiences. And I think it's a really critical skill set to have. So that's what I'm doing with the women. It's part of that process. Like I said, one woman's a businesswoman, one woman's running for Congress at some point in life. Another person is kind of starting her career. So you could be at any point in your life, and that's a great skill set to have.
That is really, really powerful. And it's funny, I didn't plan on this, but I'm just remembering now some of the other videos that we also have on our YouTube channel where people can learn more about that. First of all, we're going to make sure you know where to get in touch with Jessica before this call is wrapped up. But on our YouTube channel, I believe also from this past Fierce Fall campaign, or this Fierce Fall challenge that we did, Jessica Lyons, who's one of our Bossed Up Bootcamp trainers, does have a training on there about honing your personal story. And you're right, it is so important for all of us to be able to sort of pull out stories that are narrative formats that tell people about our values, because it makes you come across as the human being that you actually are, not a candidate, right? Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Awesome. I'm a daughter of a pastor, and he always told stories in his sermons, and so I think I learned early about storytelling. So it's
brilliant.
Kind of like, yeah,
that's awesome. So I have to get this in because I'm so excited to hear about your upcoming trips with the State Department. You're headed to Prague and to Kiev, and you're helping women in those parts of the world with election work. Can you tell me more about that, and how does your international experience relate to the women and work that you have here in the United States? What similarities do you see, and what big differences do you see?
That's a great question. So about 3 years ago, when I was running START as the executive director with Susanna Welford, I was invited by the State Department to go to Panama. It was my first trip. And so since then, I've been to Panama, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, Tajikistan. I was in Lesotho in Southern Africa in December. Going to Prague and Kiev, as you mentioned, in a couple weeks. And so I get to go talk. And the neat thing is, I think people don't realize how rad, of course, the United States is. We are, which is we fund people like myself and other experts in totally different fields to go around the world and talk about what we do and what we know. And so the embassy in country invites me to come over. Cool. And so in Kiev and Prague, what I'll be doing is talking about women's leadership in politics. And of course, I'm not coming in with being an expert about the Ukraine or Czech Republic. I'm coming in as an expert from the United States. So what I share, and kind of to lead into your second question, is talking about really the barriers for women in political leadership roles. And the cool thing that I've seen, and I think the empowering part about sort of that we have this sisterhood around the world of challenge, is the barriers we see are the same. Like literally, I use some of the exact same slides I use here as I use in Lesotho, or I use in wherever I'm in, Tajikistan, Central Asia. So that's kind of a wild, I think, reality for people to realize, which is that the barriers around women not being asked to run, not having the confidence, not feeling qualified, that they aren't being supported by their political parties, that the fundraising challenge is difficult, that the networks are different for women. Women aren't part of the male network, establishment, the boys club. All of the things that we see for challenges here in women in the US are quite similar. Now, there of course are cultural differences. So for example, when I was in Lesotho, which is a tiny little, country within South Africa, Swaziland and Lesotho are the two little countries there. They have the second highest HIV/AIDS rate in the world. So almost a quarter of the population, most of which women are the highest contractors. So of course, because I'm pretty gutsy, I'm on national television the first day I'm there, and I'm literally talking about, this is a great example of why you need more young women in leadership in your political situation. Yeah. They are the number one people who are contracting this. So that is an example of, if they're not at the table helping make this issue, why is that happening? What are they experiencing in life? What are they facing, right? So bingo. But the challenge in Lesotho, while the barriers are quite similar to our country, in that country you have a situation where women were not considered adults. They were considered minors up until 1990s. So you have no culture of women supporting one another, and you also have a culture where women are considered minors. And so you have a cultural dynamic that exists where you have to ensure that you try to fit and think about, how do we actually help advance women in this cultural context? So the barriers are the same. Yeah, but so that's kind of the unique part of it. And I'm not there to say, you have to do it this way. I'm there to say, I want to encourage you guys to think about how you can come together and make solutions, and how do you frankly broker relationships with men who have power. I think that's another part of what we have to do. And I mean, throughout, whether I'm talking about another country or this country, I think we as women, we don't look at men. I don't think we should look at men as the evil piece of it. They are the other counterpart, and they frankly have a lot of times the access to power that we are wanting. And so we need to broker those relationships and recognize how we can work with them and how they can actually help us get to where we want to go.
Right, and I think the same strategies you mentioned earlier, about being assertive, telling people what you want, asking for the help that you need. I mean, that is not just about women helping women, although we're big proponents of that. I mean, it's about reaching out to those who have power, men or women alike. I love that.
Right, exactly.
Great point. So I've got one more question for you. I know we're coming to the close here, so I want to encourage folks to tweet any of your questions. We've got some folks tweeting in, which has been so much fun, and I appreciate your comments. I want to know how we're solving these problems on the organizational level. Because like you alluded to earlier, it is not on us as women alone, right? We can't solve this problem in isolation, not only with men's help, but also there are big structural changes that we obviously need on the policy level, like paid parental leave. But also there are big steps that companies, smart companies who want to retain and develop their talent are taking to better develop their female leadership. So tell me more about the work you're doing on that level. I know you're coming out with an exciting new program next year, or next month rather, if you can preview that for us. I'd love to hear more about how you're planning to tackle this and contribute to this solution on the organizational level.
No, I love that. Well, thank you. It's kind of led, as I mentioned before, and I think this is the case for everybody in our work, your life and career, I hope, and it should feel, I think, very organic, where things move into each other and they grow, and you're kind of taking what you've learned and it's kind of moved into the space. And that's what's happened with me, which is partly the fact, while I'm a political expert and I'd like to do more work in the political sphere, frankly, a lot of my strategies I don't get hired by campaigns to do this work. While I think they need to, they just aren't going to do that. So where I see a big need in the market and a potential growth shift is in the corporate and organizational sphere. So my business partner, Kristen Hafford, and I are launching an effort next month / early April called Mind the Gap, Project Mind the Gap. And our whole notion is that a lot of organizations and companies don't recognize how to adequately facilitate building women within their companies. So part of it is this assessment for them of like, okay, where are you? You know, what is not only the policies that you mentioned, like maternal and paternity leave, which are so critical, Emily, are one little piece of the nugget. There's also all the cultural stuff around, like, how are women viewed? Where are we going after women to actually be a part of this company? How are we actually networking around that? Where are we pulling resources of them? A good example of that, maybe you guys have heard of like SheSource, which was really trying to tackle the issue of not having enough women experts on the news talking about different issues. So they just said, well, let's develop, for a better term, binder full of women, to actually pull them in and make sure that we had them as experts. I think that's a problem with a lot of companies. They're not pulling from the networks that have this robust set of women. So what we're trying to do is go into the companies and say, or the organizations and say, this is where you are. These are the cultural challenges that you have, but these are also the structural challenges you have. And then what we would go from there and say two things. One, how do we actually build women within your company? They need to be pulled together with men to be trained on this. But we also need men to recognize where they may be biased in their attitudes, or where are women biased in their attitudes. And then the third component is the structure that you mentioned. What kind of offerings are we developing? I think to actually support women. I mean, we're in this place still today, and I think a lot of you know this. I appreciate this. I'm going to sound partisan here, but about Hillary Clinton, because I think she recognizes this a lot. Our women have advanced more rapidly than the work structures support them. We still do 90% of taking care of kids and raising family. I had my mom got sick a few years ago. I was the first to jump in and help. That's very common for us. So we are still challenged by so many burdens, additional burdens, good burdens, but challenging burdens in a way that men just aren't. And that exponential difference is so critical. But we can't lose out because we're doing all those other things. The companies cannot lose out. And so the bottom line of Mind the Gap is for companies to say, you are not going to financially do as well as you could unless you can actually figure this problem out.
Right, which is well established, right, in the research that companies with more women in leadership, especially on boards of directors, are outperforming other companies. Diversity is good for business in the bottom line.
Bingo. Exactly.
Yeah, I love it.
So helping them to live it on. But I will say, and this is, I think, a good lesson for you individually, but also for a company. You have to recognize where you are. While I might want X, Y, and Z company to be over here and doing this amazing work, they may not quite be there yet. So it's for you as an individual, it's the same thing. You've got to really develop kind of where you are in your skill set. Always challenge yourself and push yourself. But there is a certain way, a phased kind of approach to actually be able to make it so that your foundation is strong. And that's what I always say is the foundation has to be strong. You can't just layer it over with Band-Aids and all of these things that'll eventually burst.
It's interesting. This to me is the problem I am obsessed with. And I think what you're saying here is like focus, but with forgiveness, right? Like, how do we balance this massive ambition that women have? And also what we started off this conversation on, which is saying, how can we get more women leaders at the table, running for office, doing all of these things that frankly are basically extracurricular, right? When women are already so overwhelmed and burdened and living in a culture of burnout, which is what I am obsessed with, obviously. So I'm just curious as to what, I love the message you're saying. And to me, the problem that keeps me up at night, the problem that drives me and Bossed Up in our work that we do is like, how do we reconcile this need for women leaders to be developed, to get the training that they need, to get ourselves self-actualized, with the reality that we are already overburdened in so many regards. Like, what do you think about that? We could talk about this over cocktails for hours, I feel like, but if you had to sum it up.
Yeah, I think that's the constant strain. I think for me, what I come down to, and it's a little bit of lean in and recognize reality and also take care of yourself. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier. It's not black and white, right? These are the two tensions of life, right? It's these obligations we feel, and frankly, that we're suited to do well, which I think is caring for others. We're built that way, and I think we're trained that way. But then we also, right, public life loses out by not having us in these dynamic, hardcore leadership roles. So I think it's not quite a black and white of it. It's a bit of a melding of the two, right? Yeah. Everything is going to be more impactful and effective when the shifts happen in both spheres. So whether that means more men take on caring roles, whether that means that the work structures actually shift to support women, whether that means the companies actually shift to support women and men and families, I think it's just not quite as simple. Because I think to your point around the stress, I just had a meeting with a woman the other day who was just bananas smart and doing kick ass and, in a very male dominated sphere, and she just burnt out. She's just done. Mm-hmm. And that is the risk we all have to take. So I think for me, and everyone's different, right? Like, my pain threshold is different from Emily's pain threshold, if you will, pain. But like, I have my own boundaries. I do a lot of self-care. For me, I need to sleep a lot. For me, I need to drink a lot of wine. For me, I need to, have fun hanging out with my with my husband and whatever. And so everyone has their own whatever that calibrate, and my girlfriends, whatever. So everyone needs that calibration for themselves. And I just think we get a lot of cultural pressure. I mean, I could talk about this for hours too, around my wedding and all that silliness, that we don't need extra stuff on us. We already get a lot of cultural messages. So about
and your wedding was rather recently, so congratulations.
Yeah, I'm within a year. I'm still a bride, if they say.
Yeah, good. Well, I am so glad to have your real talk on Career Crush with us today. Jessica, we can find out more about your work and how to get in touch with you where?
Yeah, so my website's jessicagrounds.com. Thank you for the S at the end. Like coffeegrounds.com. Nice. And my blog's on there, Jessica Speaks. I'll be updating that soon with something fresh. My last piece was on Lesotho, which I mentioned, if you want to read about my experience there.
Awesome.
So I'll be writing about that. And as you mentioned, I tweet fairly consistently about, especially at women's leadership work. So Jessica_Grounds, and Solid Ground Strategy. I have a Facebook page, and we'll be definitely keep in touch with me at my Twitter handle around Mind the Gap, because Kristen Hafford and I will be launching more details on that as in the weeks to come. Cannot
wait. And thank you again for your time. And for those bosses out there who are in the midst of navigating a career transition, I hear you. This is my life's work. This is what I am obsessed with. And if you want to get the absolute most that we have to offer at Bossed Up, you've got to apply now for Bossed Up Bootcamp, our flagship weekend training for women navigating career transition, or really major pivot points in life. If you can join us at a Bossed Up Bootcamp weekend, we have them in DC, New York, and Boston this year. All those dates are on our website in the application at bossedup.org/bootcamp. And we actually have one coming up at the end of February here in DC, where you can actually work one-on-one or work individually and as a group with experts across work, love, and wellness all in one weekend. I hope to see you there. And if you are one of the millions of people in the United States who are on the brink of burnout, we also have an online experience in which you work directly with me, and you can find out more about that at bossedupforlife.com. Thank you so much, Jessica. It is such a pleasure to have you.
Absolutely, Emily. Thank you for having me.
Great. And thanks to all the bosses for tuning in today. We'll keep in touch with that hashtag Career Crush and see you next week.